The Vessa Corridor had a smell. Sela had never been able to convince anyone of this, partly because the corridor existed in deep space and smelled nothing like anything, and partly because what she meant was that the data had a smell, a quality she had no better word for, a particular texture to the interference readings that she associated, for reasons she had never examined, with the inside of her grandmother's house on Meridian. Something old and layered, something that had absorbed decades of events and held them without judgment, without decay, without any of the editorial processes that human memory imposed on its contents. The corridor simply held things. It was the most honest archive she had ever worked in. She had been working in it, remotely, for 8 years. The survey station was a converted relay platform, technically property of the Colonial Survey Bureau, practically the property of whoever was currently living aboard it. For the last 31 months, there had been Sela and, at various intervals, a rotating cast of graduate researchers who lasted between 6 weeks and 4 months before the isolation, and the data volume drove them back to university positions with windows. She did not blame them. She had windows, too, 4 of them, looking out at the black between stars. But she had long since stopped seeing them as views and started seeing them as calibration references for the optical sensors mounted on the exterior hull. Everything eventually became data. That was what 8 years in a place like this did to a person. What the corridor did to ships was more dramatic. The interference field that gave the Vessa Corridor its navigational infamy was a product of 3 overlapping phenomena: a dense nebular remnant from an ancient stellar collapse, a pair of neutron stars in tight binary orbit at the corridor's far end, and a magnetar that had gone anomalously quiet approximately 12,000 years ago and was now generating a pulse field of extraordinary regularity at precisely the wrong frequency for most standard drive systems. Ships that entered the corridor could navigate it. Ships that were damaged when they entered it, or that sustained damage inside it, often could not exit it. The drive frequency disruption turned routine emergencies into catastrophic ones. The corridor did not hunt ships. It simply made it very difficult to leave once things had started going wrong. 40 years of conflict between the United Earth Systems and the Croth hegemony had sent a great many ships into the corridor, mostly in the corridor's role as a contested choke point between the 2 territories, a passage that each side had tried, at different periods of the war, to hold. Neither had managed it for more than 18 months. The corridor didn't take sides. It took ships. What it did with the electromagnetic signatures of those ships was a thing that made it, in Sela's considered professional opinion, the most extraordinary natural phenomenon she had encountered in 22 years of deep space archaeology. The interference field absorbed them, not destroyed, not degraded, absorbed and preserved and layered, each new signature depositing itself into the existing matrix without displacing anything that had come before. She had spent the first 3 years of her survey simply cataloging what was there. The field held signatures from the first engagement in the corridor, 40 years ago, as clearly as it held signatures from the engagement 11 months ago that had finally prompted the current ceasefire negotiations. Course vectors, engine harmonics, weapons discharge patterns, the electromagnetic residue of ship systems going offline in specific sequences, a pattern that, read correctly, told the story of how a ship had died. Final transmission fragments, not content but carrier frequency, the ghost of a signal that had once carried words Sela would never hear. 247 ships, every one of them mapped, every one of them identified, cross-referenced against the official U.S. Navy records and the partially declassified Croth engagement logs that had been released as a gesture of good faith at the start of ceasefire talks and accounted for. Every lost ship in the Vessa Corridor had a name, a registry, a date, and a cause of death that matched the record until signature 248. She found it on a Tuesday, which was a meaningless designation on a survey station that did not orbit anything, but which she maintained because the alternative was losing track of time entirely, and she had done that once, during her second year, and it had taken 6 weeks for her to care about what day it was, and she had found the experience alarming. On this particular Tuesday, she was running a long-scan validation pass, the kind of quality assurance sweep she ran every 3 months to catch drift errors, calibration shifts, anything that might have introduced artifacts into her existing dataset. It was not exciting work. It was the kind of work that she found deeply satisfying for reasons she associated with being the sort of person who alphabetized things. The anomaly flag, appeared at 14:23 station time. She looked at it for a moment without comprehension, the way you look at a word that you have read many times and suddenly can no longer parse. Then she expanded it. An unattributed signature. The sweep had found an electromagnetic pattern in the corridor matrix that was not in her catalog, which was impossible because her catalog was complete. She had spent 8 years making it complete. She ran the attribution algorithm and watched it cycle through her 247 identified ships, looking for a match. It found one on the third pass. She ran it 4 more times because the match was wrong. It was wrong in a way that made her feel slightly ill, the way you feel when arithmetic produces a number that cannot be correct and you know, with growing certainty, that it is. The signature matched the U.S. Covenant. The Covenant had not been destroyed in the Vessa Corridor. The Covenant had been destroyed in the duress system 3 years before the date stamped on the signature, in the Croth attack that killed the peace delegation and ended the talks and, as most historians agreed, made the continuation of the war structurally inevitable. The Covenant had been destroyed with all hands, including Ambassador Thessin, Deputy Ambassador Vorel, and a 12-person delegation team whose names Sela had learned in school as part of the standard curriculum on why the war had never ended. They were the names of a tragedy. They were names that had come to mean something. She was looking at an electromagnetic signature that said the Covenant had been in the Vessa Corridor, a signature with a date that was 3 years later than the ship's official destruction, and she checked this carefully, then checked it again 6 days before the peace talks at Dureth. She sat with this for a while. The 4 windows looked at the black between stars. The corridor data hummed in its servers. 40 years of war preserved in electromagnetic amber, waiting. The process of reading a ship's final hours from its corridor signature was one that Sela had developed and refined over 8 years, and it remained, despite all that refinement, something that felt less like engineering and like archaeology in the original sense. The careful exposure of something buried, the removal of layers until the thing itself became visible. You could not rush it. Rushing it produced the same result as rushing excavation. Destroyed context, lost meaning, a hole in the ground that was no longer evidence of anything. She did not rush it. She began, as she always did, with the engine harmonics. The Covenant's engine signature was in the U.S. Navy Technical Registry. She had obtained the full registry as part of her research authorization, a process that had taken 14 months and 2 formal appeals. And she had the baseline frequency for a Constitution-class diplomatic transport, the Covenant's class, overlaid against her detection data within the first hour. The match was precise, not approximate, not within acceptable variance. Precise, to a degree that eliminated any possibility of coincidence or misattribution. This was the Covenant's drive signature. This was the Covenant. She began the layer separation. The corridor's interference field was not uniform. It had structure, irregular, complex, but structure nonetheless. And over 8 years she had mapped enough of it to use it as a kind of coordinate system, locating each preserved signature within the 3-dimensional matrix of the field, and tracking its trajectory through the corridor the way you could track a particle through a cloud chamber by the line it left behind. The Covenant's track entered the corridor from a human-controlled approach vector, the standard ingress point for UES vessels, at a heading she calculated to be consistent with departure from Meridian Station, the UES diplomatic hub, the place where peace delegations assembled. The ship had entered the corridor 6 days before the Dureth talks. Sela built the entry profile first. Speed. Approximately 60% of standard cruise for this vessel class, which read to her as deliberate, not emergency deceleration, not damage limitation. A chosen speed, the kind of speed you chose when you were navigating carefully through a known hazard and had no particular reason to hurry. The ship had known where it was and had not been panicking. She filed that course straight through the corridor on the most direct traverse, which is the fastest route, but not the safest one, taking the ship through a region of heightened interference near the corridor's midpoint that most captains avoided by adding 2 hours to their transit time and 3 degrees of arc to their heading. The Covenant's captain had taken the direct route. Sela thought about that. 6 days out from Dureth. Plenty of travel time available, but pushing through the harder path anyway. Something that felt like urgency without quite being urgency. She spent 12 hours on the system status residue, which was the most technically demanding part of any reconstruction. Every piece of active equipment on a ship broadcasts a low-level electromagnetic signature as a byproduct of operation, and those signatures, drive systems, navigation, communications, life support, weapons if armed, medical if in use, were individually distinguishable in the corridor's preserved record if you knew what you were looking for. She had spent 8 years learning what to look for. She had written 2 papers on the methodology. She was, as far as she knew, the only person alive who could do this particular thing as well as she could, which had always seemed to her like a description of a career choice that had started with archaeology and ended with something more like obsession. The Covenant's weapons were offline. She noted this without surprise. A diplomatic transport on a peace mission would not have been running with weapons hot, and then noted it again when she confirmed it. Because a ship entering the Vessa Corridor, a conflict zone, with weapons offline, was a ship that was either very confident of its safety or very specifically trying to communicate something. Perhaps both. Life support, full capacity. She counted the individual signature density and arrived at an estimate between 30 and 40 individuals aboard, which are consistent with a full diplomatic team plus standard crew complement for a Constitution-class transport. Navigation, active and at high resolution, which explained the direct route choice. Someone was paying close attention to where they were going and was using the ship's navigation systems rather than pre-plotted course data. Active navigation, responsive navigation. And then there was a communications array. She ran the communications residue 3 times before she accepted what she was reading. The Covenant's communications array had been active during its corridor transit. Fully active, in a way that was unusual and conspicuous, operating at a power level that was significantly above standard for a ship in transit. Someone had been transmitting. A sustained, high-power transmission, not the brief automated identification pings that ships sent routinely, but something extended, directed, and she noted the bearer with growing stillness in her chest, aimed not at Meridian Station, not at any UES relay point, but at a vector that she needed several minutes to compute properly, cross-referencing star charts and relay network maps, and finally concluding was aimed at nothing, at no station, no ship, no installation she had any record of. The transmission had gone out into empty space. She sat with that for a very long time. Then she went back and reconstructed the transmission's timing, establishing when during the corridor transit had occurred, and for how long. It had begun approximately 40 minutes after the Covenant entered the corridor. It had lasted 11 minutes. After it ended, the ship's heading had shifted, slightly, barely detectable, but she had 8 years of practice detecting barely detectable things, by approximately 1 degree, a small correction of the kind you made when you had finished the thing you came to do and were adjusting back to your planned course. The Covenant had come to the corridor to send that transmission. Sela was as certain of this as she had been certain of anything in 8 years of work. It had not been passing through. It had come here, sent a message to a receiver she could not identify in a direction she could not account for, and then it had left. Then it had gone to Dareth. Then, according to every official record, it had been destroyed. She needed the other side of the record. She needed to know what the Croft had seen. Pell's official title was Senior Cross-Cultural Archival Liaison, which was a kind of title that institutions assigned to positions they were not entirely sure how to categorize. In practice, Pell served as the administrative bridge between the U.S. Colonial Survey Bureau's Historical Research Division and the Croft Hegemony's Archival Directorate, a role that had existed for only 3 years, since the beginning of the ceasefire talks, and that required. And Sela had appreciated this when she had first been told it. Someone who was comfortable being trusted by neither side completely and essential to both simultaneously. Pell was half human, half Croft, the product of a diplomatic liaison relationship that had occurred during the brief and optimistic ceasefire of 22 years ago. They were tall, with the gray-silver skin tone and secondary eyelid structure Croft ancestry layered over the facial architecture of human heritage in a way that had a distinctive quality Sela's brain categorized as both unfamiliar and legible, the way certain word borrowings between languages settled into their adopted tongue. Their voice was lower than most human voices and had a harmonic overtone in the mid-frequencies that Sela had learned, after several months of communication, to hear as a Croft equivalent of tone, a secondary layer meaning that native Croft speakers received automatically and that she could only partially parse. She had been working with Pell for 14 months. coordinating on a joint cataloging project that the ceasefire talks had made politically possible for the first time. They communicated primarily through the survey station's encrypted research channel. She had met them in person exactly once, at a research conference on Meridian that had been awkward for everyone in the particular way that events organized around the premise that old enemies should now collaborate were inevitably awkward. She sent them the Covenant data at 3 o'clock station time, because she had not slept, attaching a summary document that she had written and rewritten 3 times to make sure it said exactly what she meant and nothing she didn't. She told them what she had found. She told them what it meant. She asked, with as much professional composure as she could generate at 3 a.m, whether the Croth Archival Directorate held any records of the Covenant or the Dureth incident that had not been included in the ceasefire disclosure package. Pell replied 9 hours later, which she calculated meant they had been awake when her message arrived and had waited until a reasonable hour to respond, which was a form of consideration. She noted, "I need to tell you something." The reply began without preamble or diplomatic framing, which was not Pell's usual register. 2 months ago, in the course of the joint cataloging work, I found an anomaly in the Croth records of the Dureth incident. I did not report it because I did not yet understand what I was seeing. I believe I now understand what I am seeing. I think we have been looking at the same thing from different directions. The Croth record of the Dureth incident, Pell explained in the subsequent paragraphs, described the Covenant's arrival at the Dureth system, the beginning of the peace talks, and then, and this was the part that Pell had found anomalous, a Croth intelligence report, filed at a classification level that had not been included in the ceasefire disclosure package, and that Pell had access through their archival directorate clearance. The report documented the detection, by a Croth Signals intelligence installation, of an unscheduled transmission originating from within the Dureth system in the hours before the talks began. The transmission was not from the Covenant. It was not from any identified vessel. It was an encrypted signal, brief and high-powered, sent on a frequency that Croth intelligence had flagged as anomalous because it did not match any known U.S. military or diplomatic communications protocol. The Croth had concluded that this transmission was evidence of U.S. deception, that humans had sent a sabotage signal to a concealed asset before the talks began, had planned from the beginning for the talks to fail, and had staged the destruction of the Covenant to provide a justification for continued war. This was a conclusion in the intelligence report. This was, Pell said, the conclusion that the Croth leadership had received and believed. Not publicly, not officially, but believed. And here, Pell wrote, and Sela could hear the harmonic overtone even in text, the secondary layer of something very careful and very still. Here's the part that I need you to understand. The Croth record of the Covenant's destruction has been certified as accurate through every available verification process. The logs are complete. The sensor data is consistent. The timeline is continuous. And the timeline is wrong. They had found it in the sensor archive rather than the signals record. A Croth deep observation installation, positioned to monitor the Dureth approaches, had logged the Covenant's arrival in the system. The timestamp on that log was 17 hours earlier than the Covenant's log arrival time in the official record of the peace talks. The ship had arrived early. The Croth installation had seen it. Then the official record began, showing the Covenant arriving at the standard time, and the sensor log of the early arrival had been, not deleted, not forged, but reclassified, buried under 17 layers of security designation, rendered invisible to anyone without Pell's precise combination of access credentials. Someone had hidden it. Someone had hidden it without erasing it, which was either a mistake or a message. Here is what I believe, Pell wrote. I believe the Covenant arrived at Dureth 17 hours early. I believe it met something during those 17 hours. I believe it then took its position for the peace talks. I believe that when the talks failed and the ship was destroyed, both sides received a version of events that explained the destruction in terms that confirmed what each side already feared about the other. The human record says Croth attack. The Croth record says human deception. Both records are detailed, consistent, and verified. Both records have the same 17-hour gap, filled differently. Sela read this 3 times. Then she pulled up the timing. The Covenant had been in the Vessa Corridor 6 days before Dureth. It had sent a transmission into empty space. Then it had gone to Dureth. Then it had apparently arrived 17 hours earlier than the official record showed. Then the talks had happened. Then the ship had been destroyed, and the war had continued, and 40 years had become 43 years, and millions of deaths had become millions more. There was a shape to it. She could see the shape. She could not yet see what was inside the shape. "Can you come here?" She wrote back to Pell. "I need you to see the original data. Not copies. The original." They arrived 12 days later on a Croft diplomatic courier that had to file 6 separate authorizations to dock with U.S.-registered survey station during an active ceasefire, which meant that authorizations had been filed before Sela asked, because no one could have processed them in 12 days otherwise. Pell had already known they were coming. They had been preparing for this before they knew the other half of the answer. Sela found this, under the circumstances, reassuring. Pell worked quietly, which Sela appreciated. There were researchers who narrated their thinking aloud, who needed the acoustic architecture of spoken process to organize their analysis, and she had learned to work with them without losing her own thread. But she preferred the kind of thinking that happened in silence and surfaced only when it had become a conclusion. Pell sat at the secondary console with their own data package. The full Croth archival file, not the ceasefire disclosure version, the real record with the reclassified sensor logs restored to their original sequence, and cross-referenced in silence for 6 hours, while Sela did the same with the corridor data. And the only sounds in the survey station were the environmental systems and the particular frequency of the servers that she had long since stopped hearing as a sound and now experienced as a kind of background texture of the place. At the end of 6 hours, Pell said, "The transmission frequency." Sela looked up. "The unscheduled transmission that Croth intelligence detected at Direth." Pell said, "I have the carrier frequency in the original report, and you have the carrier frequency of the transmission the Covenant made in the corridor." Sela had the corridor transmission frequency in her working notes. She read it to Pell. Pell read the Direth transmission frequency in return. The harmonic overtone was very flat. The frequencies were identical. She wrote it down, because writing things down was a methodology. Evidence required physical instantiation in her thinking, a concreteness that stopped it from becoming supposition before she had finished examining it. "The Covenant transmitted on this frequency in the corridor," she said. 6 days later, someone transmitted on the same frequency at Direth. Before the talks, the Covenant was in the system 17 hours before its official arrival. The Covenant made the Direth transmission. "That is one interpretation," Pell said, in the tone that meant that is the interpretation I have also reached. "To whom?" Sela said. "Not a question, exactly. A direction. The corridor transmission," Pell said, "not toward any Croth installation. Not toward any UES relay. You confirm this." "I confirm it goes toward nothing I have a record of." "That is not the same as nothing," Pell said. It was not the same as nothing. She knew that. She had been careful in her own thinking to maintain the distinction between unidentified and absent, because the difference was precisely the thing she was looking for. Something she didn't have a record of. Something that didn't appear in either the UES Technical Registry or the Croft Installation Catalog, both of which she now had access to in their research-authorized forms. Something that occupied a position in space that neither side had a documented presence in. She had spent the 12 days since her message to Pell doing something she was not entirely comfortable describing to herself, because it was a kind of analytical extension that could, if she was not careful, slide from inference to invention. But the methodology held if she was rigorous. She had taken the corridor transmission's bearing and extended it, star chart by star chart, relay network by relay network, through the known regions of human space and into the territories beyond, using the navigational data that the ceasefire agreements had made available for the first time. The bearing ran through human space. It ran through the outer territories. It ran through the contested buffer zone. And then it ran beyond the mapped edges of cross space, into the regions that appeared on the star maps as dark space, not black, not empty, but simply unmapped, uncharted. The places that 40 years of war had left no resources and no incentive to explore. The dark between. She put on the main display now. The full star map, overlaid with the transmission bearing, extended to the current limits of the available data. Pell looked at it for a moment. "You've tried to identify what's there," Pell said. "I've tried to identify what the available data suggests might be there," Sela said, "which is different. I have the long-range survey data from the pre-war period. The U.S. had a survey program in the outer regions before the conflict consumed the budget for it. The Croft Archival Directorate holds pre-war explorer logs from the expansion period. I obtained authorization to access them through our joint project. She put the pre-war survey data on the secondary display, the Croft Explorer logs on the tertiary. She had spent a great deal of the last 12 days reading pre-war explorer logs, which were not, in the ordinary course of her work, her area of expertise, and which had required her to learn an older form of Croft archival notation that she was now functional in and would have no professional use for after this. There are anomalies in both, she said. The U.S. survey data from this region, she indicated the area the transmission bearing pointed toward, includes 2 separate entries from 2 separate survey missions, both of which report anomalous readings and then break off. The entries are filed under equipment malfunction. In one case, the mission was recalled. In the other case, the mission continued, but the anomalous readings are absent from the subsequent entries, which are otherwise complete and detailed. Something was removed. The Croft Explorer logs. Pell said, not asking. The Croft Explorer logs from the same region include 3 entries, Sela said. 2 of them are normal. The third is an account of contact with an unidentified structure, not a natural formation, a structure. The entry is 8 lines long. The mission log continues for another 37 days, and the structure is never mentioned again. Pell was quiet. That entry, Pell said eventually, is not in the version of the Explorer logs included in the ceasefire disclosure. I reviewed the ceasefire disclosure version myself as part of the joint project. I know, Sela said. I cross-referenced. So it was removed before disclosure. It was removed before disclosure, Sela confirmed. And the U.S. survey anomalies were filed under equipment malfunction rather than unresolved phenomena. Both actions, taken by 2 different institutions with no cooperative contact during the relevant period, produced the same result: the erasure from the accessible record of any indication that something exists in this region of space. Both sides, Pell said. Both sides, Sela said. Independently, or apparently independently. They sat with that. The environmental systems ran. The servers produced their subsonic texture. The 4 windows looked at the black between stars, and Sela found, for the first time, that she was not seeing calibration references. The peace talks, Pell said. The Direth talks were the 3rd attempt. The first 2 failed during the preliminary stage, the Meridian Accords and the Sethani framework. I reviewed the archival record of both when I was preparing for the joint project. Both collapsed over what was officially categorized as intelligence disputes. Each side accused the other of conducting covert operations during the negotiations. I remember, Sela said, she had been a student during the Sethani framework collapse. I looked at the original intelligence reports that precipitated both collapses. Pell said, after I found the Direth anomaly, I had not looked at them before. A pause. Both reports reference unscheduled transmissions. Both reports attribute the transmissions to the opposing side. I did not have the frequency data at the time. I have it now. Sela knew, with a specific certainty that comes not from evidence not yet examined but from pattern already established, what Pell was going to say. All 5 transmissions, Pell said. The 2 that ended the Meridian talks. The 1 that preceded the Sethani collapse. The corridor signal. The Direth signal. Same carrier frequency. Every time a path toward ending the war came close to becoming a road, the same signal fired, and each side received a version of events that made the signal the other side's fault. The harmonic overtone was doing something she didn't have a word for. 40 years. They had been doing this for 40 years. They sat in the room between them, unnamed and therefore very large. I want to show you one more thing, Sela said. The last thing was the hardest thing to explain, not because it was technically complex. It was, in comparison to the electromagnetic reconstruction work, almost simple, but because it was a thing that moved the whole edifice of inference and cross-reference and anomalous reading into a different category. It was a thing that was not an absence or a discrepancy or an anomaly. It was a presence. It was a thing that actually happened, recorded without anyone understanding its significance, preserved not in an interference field or a reclassified sensor log, but in the most mundane and comprehensive of archives, the automated navigation registry of the Vessa Corridor approach beacons, which logged every vessel that queried the beacon network, which ships queried as a routine matter of navigation, and had been querying for as long as the beacons had been operating, and which nobody had ever fully analyzed because the data volume was enormous and the purpose had seemed purely technical. She had analyzed it. She had had 8 years and a dataset that covered every ship moving through the region and a professional methodology that looked for things that should not be there and things that should be there and were not. The beacon logs cover the period beginning 31 years ago, when the current beacon network was installed, she said, and put them on the main display. I have been using them as a verification reference for my corridor work. Every ship I've identified in the corridor signatures, I've cross-checked against the beacon query logs to confirm entry timing. In the course of that work, I identified 49 beacon queries from vessels that do not match any U.S. registry entry. I initially classified these as logging errors or automated test pings from maintenance equipment. Then, after the Covenant anomaly, I recategorized them as unresolved and looked at them more carefully. 49, Pell said. Over 31 years, Sela said. Irregular intervals. No pattern I could initially find in the timing. But the query's signatures, the technical fingerprint of the beacon query, which varies by vessel class and drive type, were consistent within the 49. They were not 49 different unknown vessels. They were fewer distinct drive signatures, making multiple queries over multiple years, returning the same ships, coming back to the same region, over 31 years, on no schedule I could derive from the data alone. She paused. This was the part she had needed to be most careful about, because it was the part most vulnerable to the interpretive pressure of everything she already believed. She had checked her math 6 times. She had used 2 independent analytical frameworks. She had, on the 3rd day after Pell arrived, asked Pell to run the same analysis blind, without her results, and compare. Pell had produced the same number. 14 distinct drive signatures, she said. 14 vessels, none of them registered in any human or Croth registry available to me, visiting the corridor approach zone. Not entering the corridor, never entering the corridor, always querying the beacons and then departing on a bearing that is consistent. In every case I could track it, with departure toward the unmapped region on the transmission bearing. 14 ships going back to the same place, and the visits cluster. She overlaid the timing data. They cluster around events, major engagements, ceasefire attempts, the Direth talks. After each of those events, within weeks, one or more of the 14 signatures appears in the beacon logs, as if they are coming to assess results. The room was very quiet. After Direth, Pell said, 3 signatures. 6 weeks after the talks failed, the largest cluster in the record, Pell moved to the main console and stood looking at the star map, the transmission bearing, the clustering data, the beacon logs, all of it layered on a display in the colors she had chosen, because they were distinguishable and not because they meant anything, though she found herself now seeing significance in them she had not put there. Pell's secondary eyelids were very slightly closed. She had learned this meant they were in a state of focused internal processing that they had told her, in one of their more candid moments, was not exactly thinking the way she would understand thinking, but was the Croth ancestral cognitive mode that was most useful when the thing you were dealing with was too large to hold in ordinary conceptual space. The Croth have a record of the Direth attack, Pell said, not as a contribution to the analysis, but as something being set down carefully in its proper place. The record describes a coordinated U.S. weapons discharge, multiple simultaneous strikes. The pattern is consistent with U.S. military doctrine for the period. I have reviewed the tactical manuals. It matches. The U.S. record describes a Croth ambush, Sela said. Prepositioned ships. The signature pattern of the attack matches Croth ambush doctrine for the period. Both accounts were written by people who believed them, Pell said. Both accounts were written by people who received accurate sensor data, describing an attack that matched what they expected the other side to do, Sela said. The sensor data was accurate. The interpretation was constructive for them. She had been thinking about this part. You don't forge something that's clean with false records. False records have seams. These records have no seams. You achieve this with real events that are interpreted in pre-prepared frameworks. You make something happen that both sides will see and that both sides have been primed to understand as the worst thing the other side could do. The Covenant, Pell said. The Covenant came to the corridor first, Sela said. It sent a transmission. Then it went to Dareth. During the 17 hours before the official talks began, something happened. I don't know what happened in those 17 hours. I don't have a record that covers that. What I have is everything on either side of them. It is enough, Pell said. It is enough, Sela agreed. Pell turned from the display. The secondary eyelids had returned to their normal position. I want to say something that is outside the methodology, they said. You should know it is outside the methodology. I know. The war has lasted 43 years, Pell said. I was born during it. My father is human. My mother is Croth. They met during the second ceasefire, which lasted 14 months, which ended when the Sedhani framework collapsed, which you have now told me collapsed because of the same frequency signal as every other collapse. My parents spent the next 21 years in correspondence that had to route through neutral stations because direct human-Croft communication was technically an act of conspiracy under both wartime legal frameworks. I grew up in the correspondence. I grew up reading letters that took 3 months each way because they had to avoid the wartime routing restrictions. The harmonic overtone was doing the thing she didn't have a word for. I believe the war was something that two peoples did to each other because of history, and because of Dareth, and because of the accumulated weight of 40 years of deaths that neither side could simply set aside. I have built my career on the premise that the war is a human problem and a Croft problem, and that the path forward is through the space between the two positions. And now, Sela said, and now I need to think about what it means that the path between the two positions may have been deliberately blocked. Pell said, by something that is neither. Sela looked at the evidence. She looked at all of it, laid out on the displays and the colors that did not mean anything and that had come to mean everything. The beacon logs and the transmission frequencies, and the missing 17 hours and the mirrored lies and the 14 unregistered ships visiting the same impossible region of space for 31 years to see how the latest carefully constructed catastrophe had landed. She thought about Ambassador Thessan, whose name she had learned as a child as the name of a tragedy. She thought about the delegates whose names she had also learned. She thought about 247 ships preserved in electromagnetic amber in the corridor, and all the ships not in the corridor, and all the dead, and then she stopped thinking about the dead because the number was too large to hold, and she needed to hold what was in front of her. Who benefits from a war between us? She said. Pell was quiet for a long time. The environmental systems ran. The servers produced their subsonic texture. Outside the 4 windows, the black between stars held an enormous silence. Someone who needed us both looking the other way. Pell said. The sentence settled into the room, and neither of them moved for a moment, because the sentence was the shape of the thing, and the thing was very large, and once you had spoken the shape of it, you could not unspeak it, and what came after the speaking was different from what had come before. Sela looked at Pell. Pell looked at Sela. Then, together, not planned, not coordinated, simply the same movement arising from the same conclusion reached at the same moment through 8 years of work and 14 months of collaboration, and 12 days of the final proof assembling itself piece by careful piece. They both looked at the star map on the wall. The star map was large, the best available composite from UES and Croft navigational data, covering the known territories of both species, and the contested regions between, and the buffer zones, and the Vessa Corridor in its accurate position, and the DRS system, and the 14 other systems that had names because ships had gone there and recorded what they found. She had put it up when she installed the station because a navigation historian without a star map was a person who had forgotten what they were doing, and over 31 months it had become part of the room's texture the way the server hum had, present and unremarkable. She looked at it now and saw something different from what she had been seeing. She looked past human space, with its colonies and stations and the mapped arteries of its commerce and its wars. She looked past the territories that the Croft had mapped on their side, the formations named in Croft archival notation for the explorers who had first recorded them. She looked past the contested regions and the buffer zones, past the far edges of both known territories, past the places where navigational data grew sparse and the explorers' logs grew shorter and eventually stopped. She looked at the regions beyond. The dark between cross space and whatever came after it. The dark beyond the outermost human survey markers. The vast, unmapped, uncontested, unexamined dark that neither side had explored because 40 years of war left no budget for exploration, and because there had always been another engagement to plan, another ceasefire collapse, another year of the same conflict that had continued, and continued, and continued, while something in the dark had watched both sides carefully through 14 unregistered ships and a signal frequency that nobody had ever thought to compare between records. Watched them, kept them busy, kept them small, kept them looking at each other. The dark between held its enormous silence. The proof was complete. The evidence was real, sourced, cross-referenced, methodologically rigorous, replicated through independent analysis, preserved in original form across multiple archives that the analysts in question had been authorized access through legitimate research credentials that had taken years to obtain. The evidence could be presented. It could be published. It could be submitted to the ceasefire negotiators, to the historians, to the journalists on both sides who had spent careers covering a war whose origin they believed they understood. It could change things. It was a kind of evidence that, when it reached the right people in the right form, had historically changed things. And whoever had arranged those 43 years of war had known this was always possible, had built their deception across two separate civilizations' records and two separate civilizations' histories, without leaving, for 40 years, a seam, had done this work with a thoroughness that was itself information about what they were and what they were capable of, had 14 ships that were not in any registry Sela had access to, and the resources to make censored data describe attacks in perfect accordance with each side's tactical doctrine, and had been watching the corridor approach beacons. Would be watching now. Sela understood this. She thought Pell understood it too, because Pell was still looking at the star map with the secondary eyelids slightly closed, in the cognitive mode for things too large to hold in ordinary conceptual space, and neither of them had said what came next. What came next was what they decided to do with this. What came next was a step after the proof. The translation of evidence into action, the moment where the methodology handed over to something else, some other discipline she had not spent her career developing. What came next was not archaeology. But here was the thing about archaeology. It was not, had never been, purely historical. The things you dug up were old. The reason for digging them up were present tense. You found an ancient civilization city, and you understood something about what cities were, and why they rose and why they fell, and that understanding was not confined to past, but lived in the present and informed the future. You found an electromagnetic signature in an interference field, and you learned that the ship it belonged to had been in a place it was not supposed to have been, and the reason you kept looking, the reason you pulled the signature apart layer by layer, the reason you spent 8 years mapping the residue of a 40-year war, was not because the past was interesting. It was because the past was still happening, because the dead were still dead, and the war was still running, and the ceasefire negotiations were still ongoing, and somewhere in the dark between the regions of the star map was something that had spent 4 decades maintaining conditions for its own concealment, and had so far succeeded, and did not know that 2 people in a converted relay platform had just finished understanding what it had done. Sela looked at the evidence. She looked at Pell. She thought about her grandmother's house on Meridian, and the smell of the archive, and the moment 8 years ago when she had understood that the corridor's interference field would preserve the electromagnetic signatures of lost ships permanently, perfectly, like insect and amber, had preserved them not for corridor's benefit, not for any purpose at all, but simply because that was what the corridor did, indifferently and completely and without any editorial intervention, and that this made it the most honest archive she had ever worked in, and that this meant that sooner or later, if someone looked carefully enough at the right part of the record, the truth would be there exactly as it had been on the day it happened. Someone who needed them both looking the other way. 43 years. The dark between the stars on the wall. Look back at them. Pell said, "We should make copies." "We should make many copies," Sela said. "And we should be very careful about where they go." "And we should be very careful," Pell said, with a harmonic overtone carrying what it always carried, the secondary layer, the thing underneath the words, about how much time we take. Outside the 4 windows, which Sela was no longer seeing as calibration references, the black between stars was the same black it had always been. It did not look different now that she knew something was in it. That was the thing about the dark. It never looked like anything. It just looked like absence, which was what it wanted to look like, which was, as she had spent her professional life learning, the oldest and most effective form of concealment. You hid things not by making them invisible, but by making people not know to look. She had looked. She had found. She opened a new file in the archive. She gave a name. She began, with the precision and the patience that 8 years and a complete methodology afforded, to write down exactly what she knew and how she knew it, and what she believed it meant, in language clean enough that there would be no question and careful enough that there would be no seam. The servers hummed. The environmental systems ran. The star map watched them from a wall. The work continued.